Today on our Tech for Business podcast, we're joined by Kyle, our president and CEO, and Todd, our COO and CISO. With the year coming to a close, a lot of businesses are feeling that end-of-year budget squeeze. So today, we're talking about how to make the most of what's left and what absolutely cannot be put off. If you're at the end of your fiscal year, what do you feel like you still want to get in under the wire?
Anything you need to purchase from us? No, I'm just kidding. I think most of the side, just to dial back, I think it's important just to have a budget and to have the planning and the other side of it. As we work with a lot of customer sides of those, they tend to be, not as planning forward. And it tends to create surprises in those organizations. And then you wind up with what you should be considering to, spend to make your technology work for you and enhance your productivity in other aspects, but also to protect you from new risks that are constantly evolving out in the space. So there's new considerations that you always should be having the conversation, so you expect and plan for those increased expenditures. As we go through the planning with customers, you have your typical hardware life cycle, as we call it. Mm-hmm. So making sure your workstations, as they reach, a 5-year or a 3-year, whatever your needs are, as far as your, how close you want to be to newer technology sides on it. Having those plans to say we're going to do, 25 or 20% of our computers every year side of it, and knowing which ones they are, so you can plan accordingly and know that that's planned and spread it out and plan through the year, so you can spread those costs out, both from labor and cost. You have your subscription renewals that are typically applied to things like firewalls and different software packages and those things that can, many cases, are annualized. So you have to want to have those planned, so you're not getting surprises come up.
Yeah.
And I know, obviously, as a leader, I don't like seeing, if we have to replace our servers or larger infrastructure side, and it's a surprise, that it would end of life, you need to get through there, and now you're facing, 50,000, 100,000 plus that wasn't planned in a business cycle side of that. For small and medium business, that's not a good surprise. So I think having those, just having that planned side of it for things you should be aware of, and then augmenting that and in what new you should be considering to factor into your budget, just puts your technology in a much better place. I think you're going to make better purchase decisions. They're not as last minute. You probably get the right technology, versus if it's last minute and unplanned, you may ask to scale it down or try to reduce the cost, which again may not get you into probably the right solution overall, because you're not going to get the run with it. If you're scaling it down, for example, you may not get what you would expect from the life cycle side of it, where, for example, purchasing underpowered computers, or having to go to, an aftermarket to purchase your computers because you can't afford to purchase the newest technology side of that, is ultimately going to affect the longevity of those things. So you're not going to probably get, the 5 years or the other sides of it. You're going to experience hardware failures sooner. You're going to experience performance degradation. You may be limited in new software capabilities, such as we're seeing with Windows 11, and end of life of Windows 10 coming up next year side of it. Those are things that, can impact a business that just lack of planning and budgeting side of it. So just to kind of preface that side.
Yeah.
And the only thing I would say for this year and the planning side of it is I think anything you can do around, risk mitigation is stuff that we're always talking about side of it. And I think having that plan side of things around zero trust and those other areas sides of it is where, most organizations are lacking, just because it is newer. It is something, again, that hasn't probably been traditionally purchased year to year, because it is newer in the risk reduction framework side of what gets applied. So having those discussions, saying what else can we do to reduce our risks as we go into the new year side of it, should always be things to discuss. And that can be a number of different things. So it's kind of not just one size fits all. It's going to change a little bit for each organization depending on what they've currently already done. Todd, anything you want to add on that?
Easy. I'm done. We've got a bunch of, I think you nailed a whole bunch there. I mean, I agree. When we work with a lot of organizations, we do often see where organizations may or may not have a formal budget in place, if you will. And you tend to get into a lot of reactionary type things as you get into the end of the year. However, I'm going to assume that most organizations at least have some sort of budget. And again, depending on the organization, you can potentially get into some nuances in budgeting where you've got capital expenditures versus operational expenditures. In case anybody's curious about the major differences, is your capital expenses tend to be more of those fixed cost items, your infrastructures, those types of things. And then your operational expenses tend to be the ones that are going to be more like cloud computing, Office 365, that type of stuff. So your OpEx, when it comes to budgeting, it's kind of set. It's static. It rarely goes up and down other than unless it's on a usage system. And so I'm going to assume that you're getting to the end of the year, you still have some budget dollars left in your capital expenditure. Assuming that you're mature enough to have those things, you probably have some things in place that you weren't anticipating covering. And as Kyle mentioned, if you've got things, he kind of hit it on a level that I'll refer to as technical debt. If you've got technical debt, which would be your old assets in place, those would be the things that you should just probably plan on getting them in place. A lot of times, a lot of people will kind of pull them up, put them off and say, well, I'll worry about that later. And they tend to kick the can, which is how you get technical debt in the first place. But as you get to the end of your fiscal year, it's usually a great time to go, okay, well, I was planning on doing it anyway. I've got X amount of budgets. Proceed to use it. And so that typically falls into the hardware category. But I do agree with what Kyle's saying too. If you have plans on risk mitigation, whether that's multi-factor authentication or some other type of big initiative, it can be scary to try and pull the trigger on that at the end of the year. However, I will say, assuming that you're on a calendar year, one of the best times to make a purchase is at the end of the year. Manufacturers and software developers are highly motivated to close business before the year is over.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add on like the hardware side of it is, as we approach the end of 2024, just to date stamp this episode a little bit side of it, there's because of the new administration coming in, there's talks of tariffs. And that may introduce additional costs, obviously, to the hardware side. So to Todd's point, if you have budget left, and this would probably speak true as we go through, and costs tend to go up, so if purchasing now is going to probably be cheaper than it is going to be by the end of the, throughout 2025 or whatever the next year coming through, that the days of the hardware getting cheaper that we experienced, a while ago side of it has seemed to be gone. I mean, every manufacturer now, we can only look at quotes for about 30 days because it changes rapidly. They're going to say, we're going to have a 5% increase. We're going to have a 10% increase in these things. The supply chain is very, very sensitive to costs, and they've been increasing quite, dramatically in very short notice. It is not shorter. So purchasing now is going to be cheaper. So if you have some budget dollars left over, getting the hardware to say we can purchase some PCs now versus waiting into next year, I'd do it. If you're close on a server refresh and you got some dollars, do it. Switches, whatever the hardware is, to Todd's point, that hardware CapEx, just do it. It's going to be more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I just to kind of fine point that is, we don't know what's going to happen when we hit the beginning of 2025. We don't know if tariffs are going in. They're talking about it. Typically, what ends up happening when tariffs go is your costing gets passed on to the consumer, which means if that's true, you increase the tariffs, that means the cost of hardware is going to go up. That sometimes does impact some supply chain too. So the last time we had a little bit of a tariff increase a couple of years ago, supply chain got a little slowed down, shall we say. So I would anticipate that as well too. And I don't mean that as a scare tactic, just this is how things typically work. So again, if you got the budget and you're hanging on to it, now might be the good time to say the sooner you do that, the more likely you are to mitigate that cost going up and running into supply chain issues. And I know we're focused heavily on hardware there, but it does apply to a lot since in the IT world, a lot of equipment does come from overseas.
Yeah, and even the components inside there, even if they assemble it in the United States, so much of the chips and the other components that go into it are all supplied from, international sources side of it. So there's a lot of factors to all that. And even throughout this year, like I said, we've saw, just a lot of a substantial number of price increases just continuously throughout the year. The manufacturers are not waiting to the end of the year. They're very in tune to saying our prices are going up next month. So it is very fluid, and it can definitely impact to go through it. And software is not immune to that either. We've definitely seen even the subscription services and everything else is starting to increase. I was just made aware that just from server 2025 from server 2022, which at the time of this just flipped over side of it, it's about an 8 to 10% increase in price for that server licensing from Microsoft. So those things can change pretty quickly, and so if the it's always going to be cheaper to do it now, is basically what I want to say.
Yeah.
It's the future is not going to reduce price. There was a time and period that used to be the thought that technology always gets cheaper as we go through those things. That does not seem to be the case anymore. So if you have the capital and you have the dollars to do it, and if you're looking at software side of those, consider locking in, because a lot of times you can, if you purchase the annual subscription side of that, you can lock it in for now, so you avoid the immediate price change versus trying to go month to month side of that. You can save some dollars by doing that too, to increase your commitment time a little bit. There's some other things you can do to save some dollars now. Spend it now and save it.
Todd, you made a good point about having a leg to stand on at the end of the year. These sales want to happen. People, want to get their hardware, and you could maybe talk your way into a different price. If you don't have a fiscal year ending in December, if you're those July people or June, how does that change your experience in budgeting? Does that make sense? Like you don't have, you're having different conversations about pricing.
You could be. It does largely depend on how, which I kind of alluded to this maturity piece a little bit earlier too. Depending on how you do things, in my opinion, budgeting is not about always the best deal. Sometimes it's about getting the right equipment.
Yes.
However, it may play a role, right? I don't personally, I don't buy into the I gotta work my vendors over so hard that there's no way we can possibly make the deal work. But I am looking for a fair deal too. There are benefits to waiting to the end of the year, but even if your fiscal happened to be in July, you still could potentially go, I know that when I get to year end, the calendar year end, I am going to get a better deal. So if you're savvy enough and you've planned things out accordingly, you potentially could put things in play where you get to the end of the year and say, I got to make the purchase before the calendar year is up. If you do it right, it does work out. That being said, there are tactics you can use throughout the year too. Quarters, more often than not, software vendors can be very accommodating to hearing you out as well. So it is a possibility. It's not a slam dunk, but it does happen. I think the biggest thing that I was going to kind of circle back on it too is I don't know where everybody is at. So if you don't have a budget, starting to put one together makes a ton of sense. You should at least, Kyle kind of alluded to this already too, is you should already inherently know that on an average, you're going to replace computers every 5 years, your servers every 7. You've already got that in mind. You're doing it anyway. But to put it down on paper and plan for it and say, I'm going to spend this amount of money and how that spends throughout the year, so I'm not buying 100 laptops in December, you have the ability to kind of spread that out. It helps the organization a lot. And if you've got a finance person, they'll love you for doing it too. And so anyways, where I was going with that is it does help when you get to the end of the year, and you can plan accordingly, even if your fiscal doesn't end at the same time. The one other piece that I was going to put in there is if your fiscal does end with the calendar years, and I don't know that this is true about all organizations, but if you do have a formal budget in place, I've seen many organizations where it's kind of a use it or lose it. If you don't use that budget this year, it does not roll into 25. You're going to have to start all over from zero again, and your budget's the same. So when you get into the conversation of what should I buy, again, if you've got a plan and you have budget left over, it'd be a good time to execute your plan.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also going to ask, if you do have a budget and you are planning well, how many companies really do have an end of year, surplus? Are there a lot of people sitting down and having another budget conversation at the end of the year? Or I imagine if you have a plan, you've probably, lockstep spent it like you plan to.
Yeah, usually you have some contingencies you factor into your budget. So, say for example, you budget a number, say $2,500 per laptop or workstation that you acquire, but you're factoring in, but your actual acquisition is say 1,800. So you have extra allocation side that you left for some contingencies because life happens, things unexpected may pop up that while you're looking at a certain percentage side of it, there may be some additional ones that you had a failure, it was out of warranty, you didn't plan on it, it was pre 5 years, so you had to replace some other ones. There's always things that happen throughout the course of the year that you may need to pivot. You may need to purchase some additional wireless for that you didn't originally foresee needing to do. There's stuff that happens. So we always recommend that when you do those things to, factor in a percent over the actual cost side of it to give you some of those contingency funds to do some of those things. If things went well and you didn't have all those things, then you can still make, again, some of those strategic decision sides of it to say, well, I can get it cheaper now. I'm going to use some of this extra allocated budget money to get this done now, and they don't have to do it next year. So the company is actually coming out better. They plan for it. So financially, again, the finance team is happy with you because you're not surprising them. But now you're also able to save the company probably some money, so I'd do it a little earlier than having to try to get it in next year's budget. So you don't have to go through those things. So there's a lot of good things just by having that plan, going through those. It's just like you're kind of creating a small, contingency fund to be able to plan for, but maybe you can use it for something a little more proactive at the end.
Yeah, I'd echo those thoughts exactly. Typically, the way that I would anticipate budgeting happening is it typically starts a good, 3-4 months in advance of the next year. And when you're doing that and you're planning, you've got certain things in mind. Like we said, there's certain things you just know you're going to do. You're going to replace hardware. You're going to do X, Y, and Z. And so you've got that in the budget. Where you get with the contingency is there is, as Kyle said, there's going to be something that comes up. It always does. Even if you've got a really robust network, computers, whatever, something inevitably comes up. We talk to a lot of companies where the phrasing ends up coming out inevitably is, we don't know what we don't know. And somewhere throughout the year, something will pop up and they'll go, oh, wow, we had no idea that was whatever, a risk, something I needed to be aware of, whatever. It just happens. And it's unfortunate that it does because it's not easy to anticipate everything under the face of the sun. But because those things do happen, if you have that contingency fund in place, and again, assuming that the finance people allow you to do that, that gives you the ability to pivot into something that you weren't planning because you didn't know you needed to. So if you can work in a contingency thing, it is absolutely a huge play because you will need it. And as Kyle said, if you can find ways to come under your budget so you can save it, that also gives you more wiggle room, regardless of what that is. I mean, just to kind of throw things out there from personal experience, when I've done those things, having those savings in my back pocket allowed me to do things at the end of the year that I hadn't anticipated. For example, we got into additional app dev things where we said, oh, this becomes this is going to be a little bit different. We don't totally talk about this, but it's a variable cost, right? I can turn something on temporarily. I can get a burst of app development that I can outsource for whatever, I'll say 100 hours. I have the budget that I can go do something that I had not anticipated, but there's going to be a huge business return on it. I'm going to get better reporting. Something's going to get improved. I'm going to get new functionality or automation I never had. Because I saved money, I've got the flexibility to do something that's variable. And then when I get it, I get to turn it off, and that cost does not become operational. I don't have to constantly feed the machine.
For sure. So, I mean, we're focused a lot on end of year, which was kind of the topic, but it's worth talking a little bit about planning ahead. How are these tax incentives? I know there's some, if you're like a nonprofit, sometimes you can get grants for technology. Sometimes there's this like pile of money and budget that you could maybe access. How does that change your planning? Especially with a grant, you may or may not get that. How is that going to change how you plan for the year?
It does.
Yeah,
it definitely does. Yeah.
Well,
Do you just throw that initiative out the window, or is this where this contingency money comes in? How can you sort of maximize that type of support?
Typically with the grants, there's you have to meet the criteria what the grant is designated for. So, so they're very targeted typically to say that to qualify this grant is be used for this particular technology, say it's cloud services or whatever. So you're assisting and writing the justification side of it. So typically that's something net new or an improvement side of it. So more of a planning or project-based side of it, not the reoccurring, kind of the known variable sides of those. The known variables you want to have just pure budgetary, but assuming you don't get the grant, you still want to be able to do those things, right? Because you don't want to be on the possibility of not being able to maintain the hardware life cycle or needed subscriptions that you need to run the business on. So this would be some overall more related to the variable cost that Todd was probably referring to. It's a project, something that's going to happen and then it's done. Because again, it's grant, you won't want to have it in your ongoing operational side of it, because where are you going to get the funding from? You need to have the funding source for it. So that would probably give you some overall improvement to the business that's going to create something that new that you didn't have. If you're moving to like the cloud side of that, you got to say, because it's going to cover the deployment or other costs to get you there, but then the operational expenses would be replacing some other fixed expense. And hopefully it's going to save you or be equal to that ongoing to cover the operational budget going forward. So those are usually just the overall planning discussion to say, if we get the grant and we qualify it, then we'll do it.
Sure.
I would say that's by far the most typical is we're going to try to get this through. If it doesn't work, we'll pump the brakes on it. And if you're nonprofit, there's usually other ways that they try to do it, fundraisers, referendums, you name it. There's all kinds of ways where they try to come up with the additional funds. The other strategy that you potentially could do, and I don't see this implemented very often, but hypothetically, you could potentially still budget for it and say, worst case scenario, we've got it in our budget, which gets you into that contingency too. So if the grant does come through, you go, oh, great, I've got this chunk of money that I had budgeted for this. I can now use it for something else. Or the company says, great, we were hoping we didn't have to use that. We plan to use it over here instead. So it's a possibility, but I don't see that one happening all that often.
Yeah, and the tax side of it, I'm not a tax
I know
CPA or other side with it. But I mean, in general practice, we would take the approach to say, certainly consult with them and make sure you maximize it. But typically, again, if you don't have the budget dollars, getting the write-off when you don't have the budget dollars to cover doesn't necessarily help you, so, but you want to maximize the returns and make sure, how your, most of the equipment side of it fits into some kind of, writable, deductible situation to a point. So it's definitely recognizing that. Again, that's more of a finance person's, or a tax CPA to answer the better questions to make sure you maximize it. But it'll help probably offset some of the overall ongoing expenditure side of it. But I would think by planning and knowing what you want, to go to that tax advisor and just say, this is what we're planning for side of it. How does this help? Is there things we should consider that would maximize our tax benefits with this as well, just to create a synergy and alignment with that? Because them being aware of that could advise you the best way to spend those dollars, certainly, and get some tax benefit out of it as well. So again, I think the planning just helps with the benefit, making that a beneficial discussion.
Yeah, I agreed. I mean, I'm not a tax guy either. So, but what Kyle said really resonates with me is it's all about planning, right? And the planning isn't done in a silo. It's done with a group of individuals. And so if you've got your accounting and tax team working with you, you can kind of navigate some of those things. There are things out there. And again, I'm not an expert, but I know there are various deductions that are out there where, getting back to the capital expenditure, normally what ends up happening is you make the purchase and then you amortize it over the course of a period of time as you start to depreciate it. And I know that some of those things allow you to do the depreciation all at once, but how that works, how you plan for it, how you budget for it, that's not my sweet spot, unfortunately.
Yeah. For sure. So as we kind of wrap up a little bit, what advice do you have as someone is sort of ending the year or, getting into their planning for the next year? Obviously, planning is a huge one. How do you prioritize? And then are there any trends or big changes that you guys see coming that you think people should watch or put into their budget or be ready to add at a later time?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There's a lot
that was
there.
A big question.
And I know I kind of covered this on the onset side of it. Again, the budgetary planning side of that, you would probably want to have started this a while ago. Again, to Todd's point, it's usually about a 3-month process, because it does take time to go through and get all the information and go through those things. So, but again, if you haven't done it for it, there's no time to start better than now. I mean, just getting the plan in place to get those things placed. Start with what do I got for hardware life cycle? What's aging out? Prescriptions. Just get the known variable stuff done to go through those things. Things that we're having discussions with that are more net new side of it come around strategic planning. So for example, if you're looking at some point, you're looking at probably server replacements, other sides of those. Is there a cloud solution versus using the server side of that may be something to be planning for? And usually I like those even on like a multi-year plan side of it, to say, not necessarily next year's side, but maybe in the following year, the servers and storage and other things may be coming up for renewal, to give us enough time to transition and get us into a position where when that renewals come up, we're no longer needing to use that equipment. It could be an 18 to 24 month time frame to get through the labor and time and people impact to make those decisions and changes. Going to a cloud, ERP system from on-prem, that's a long runway you want. That isn't something you want. You can't do that in 3 months. And even to do it in 12 is very aggressive. You need to have a very good plan of how you're going to do that. But eliminating the CapEx and moving it to an OpEx is what you're kind of talking about, to go through those things. So it's a longer term plan that you're communicating to the finance team. They understand it. They kind of look through it to say, okay, we're not going to have this capital expenditure, but I'm now going to see more monthly OpEx spend. So you're kind of changing that amortization schedule that Todd said for an OpEx, where rather than spreading the cost out 5 years, you just pay it every month. So, but it reduces infrastructure, reduces power, reduces a lot of other things, and then you get out of the every 5-year cycle. So it does change your methodology around how you're acquiring things. That's very common. I mean, most customers that we're talking to now is the question side of it, is we like to have more cloud and less on-prem. They're kind of getting out of the hosting on-premise business side of it. A high percent, not all, and it doesn't fit all areas of every business, but there, a high portion of it, if not all of it, trying to get it into a cloud operation side of it. So a lot of planning, a lot of strategic guidance around that, and then it's anything around different ways to protect to protect the environment with risk mitigation side of those. Todd mentioned MFA side of it, not there, but there's other things to say, your traditional VPN, which again, if you have on-premise resources and they're having to use some VPN technology to access that, there's a lot of risks that are being exploited around that side of it to create that extra entry point into those. There are zero trust ways to use, to get in that's away from the firewall side of that and using more of a ZTNA side of it, which uses kind of a proxy-based connection into the network side of it. It's more modern, has different security layers, and it's more limited trust. It's only to the resources in particular areas you need, not the whole network style access side of it. Those are discussions to say, can we change and go to a modernization of that side of it? That's more on a least privilege model side of it. Those are discussions that are very popular. And then different AI, tool sets, your Microsoft Copilot, those types of things that are additional licenses to consider that may help productivity of users by bringing in some kind of AI assistance or even AI development side of that into your additional operations. Seems like every software platform out there now has some kind of AI add-on to them that may be beneficial to review. So there's a lot of things to consider.
Yeah, I was going to go down the path of where Kyle was going with a lot of the infrastructure too. I mean, some of the strategies you can use is if you've got some aging equipment that's coming end of life, you start to get to plan and say, I know in 3 years I need to do X, Y, and Z. But he covered that pretty well. So I'll pivot on to some other things. You'd asked the question, are there things we should be planning for? And in my opinion, the answer is absolutely yes. There's two things in particular that I think are a little bit longer term budget concepts, and you should really start to get your head around them now. And one of those is passwordless. I think we're getting to the point where passwords have more than reached the end of their lives. And unfortunately, while it seems like passwordless would be super easy, you just turn on Windows Hello and off you go. It's not easy. It's actually incredibly complex because your passwords are interwoven into everything, which means that you're getting into a fairly significant potential for infrastructure change. And because of that, the other thing that I would throw on there is, what does your infrastructure look like 3 to 5 years from now? And I would say if you're not planning for zero trust, the time to start planning for that is now. And that should be a 3 to 5 year plan. So if you start to look at what that looks like, you're looking at, more often than not, most of our organizations are still using traditional legacy Active Directory on their network, and it's an absolute disaster from security perspective. And so you've got to figure out where you're going from here. And again, because it's so deeply ingrained into the infrastructure of IT, you have to have a very strong plan. Because you have to have a strong plan, you have to know where you're going, you have to build the plan, you have to budget it. I'll use an example of, you potentially need to change your identity from Active Directory to Entra or Okta or something along those lines. Again, that's no small thing. You're re-wrenching your network. Potentially, as Kyle mentioned, you're going to the cloud. You might want to look at what's referred to as a SASE product, which is SASE or SSE, whatever the acronym they want to use. Again, major re-wrenching of the network where you potentially go, how am I going to pay for this? Well, number one, you got to put a budget out there saying 3 years from now, I'm going to be spending whatever the number is, $15 per user in the company per month. And then you go, okay, well, how am I going to pay for that? Well, I can go to firewall as a service because that's included in my SASE. So I don't need to replace my firewall in 3 years, so on and so forth. So it's a big thing to get in there. But if, as Kyle mentioned, the whole point is start planning, get your blocking and tackling in place, get your hardware replaced, make sure you budgeted for your internet connectivity. But then you say, okay, well, next year, what am I going to do? Year 3, what am I going to do? And is that matching up? I know that sounded like a lot, and it probably is. So if you need help, there are people out there that can help you through that process, because re-wrenching your infrastructure is a big deal. But the two things that I would say, just to reiterate that, is passwordless is coming, and you need to start getting your plan together. And I'd start planning for your zero trust network as well.
Yeah, that planning is just huge. I mean, because the decisions you make and how you deploy your new equipment as you go forward, knowing where your destination is, to say, again, we want to be off Active Directory in 3 years or whatever it may be. Again, you're spreading the labor and cost and human impact across, that time frame. So it lessens the impact to the productivity and impact to organization for such a large shift. But allows you to, start making decisions now that align with that end game. So you're making better purchase decisions, and you don't find yourself going, well, now I got all this stuff and now I got to just come back and retouch it all. I got to redo it all, so, labor being probably your largest expense of many of these things is the labor component. So, to redo that is very costly. So doing it under the plan, you can do it correctly the first time, and get to that end goal in a planned manner is going to be so much better for everybody.
So it sounds like our number one thing is plan. So if you're listening to this and you're feeling like, oh no, we do have other podcasts. We have other podcasts about how to plan specifically for technology, specifically for hardware. So I'm going to make sure all of our budgeting and budget planning podcasts are linked in the description. So check those out or give us a call. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this topic, please let us know. Like, subscribe, or reach out to us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website, cit-net.com/podcast. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.